Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Steve, this is Legion Creative, and today we're talking about exposure, more specifically, shutter speed. In the last video, I talked to you about aperture, which is basically an opening in the center of your lens that you can control. You can close it down, which lets less light through it, or you can open it up nice and wide, and that allows a lot more light through it. And we use this to control our exposure. It's one of three tools that are built right inside the camera that allow you to affect the final image that you create. Now, there is a secondary effect to that, and that's called depth of field. In a nutshell, the bigger the aperture, the less depth of field you're going to have, the less things that are in focus, and the smaller that aperture, like tiny little hole, the more depth of field you have, the wider that range of acceptable focus is. Something I forgot to mention in all my explanations of that in the last video, and I apologize for that, was the way that we measure that. Now, in photography, we measure it with something called f-stops, and in cinema, we use the phrase t-stops. They are essentially the same thing. They are measured slightly differently to create the numbers, but they are pretty comparable. Basically, what it is an f-stop is a measurement of the amount of light that passes through that aperture in a given amount of time. So each aperture has a specific measurement, and each aperture is either half or double the previous one. So if we're going down, if we're closing off our aperture, each aperture is a little bit smaller, it's having less light, so it would be this much light, half of this much light, half of that much light, et cetera, et cetera. If we're opening up our aperture, if it's getting wider, going the other way, then this aperture has X amount of light. This one has 2X, it has twice as much. This one has twice as much of the previous, et cetera, et cetera. And that's pretty much the way it works. T-stops work the same way. It's just that the measurement of how much light varies a little bit. So you don't really need to worry too much about T-stops until you get up to professional grade cinema lenses. So don't stress if you don't get that part too much. But yeah, I apologize for not mentioning that last time. Hopefully, if you've watched that video, you've now watched this one and you've caught up on that little additional part that I forgot to mention. Now, I did mention aperture. It is the first thing that controls exposure in your camera system because the light comes through your lens and the first thing that it hits, the first thing that's going to affect it is that aperture. Coming through the lens and into the camera, the next thing it's going to hit is the shutter. That's the second line of exposure control. Think of it that way. Now, while aperture controls the exposure by the size, either a bigger or smaller hole, a shutter controls exposure with time. Basically what it is, it's a little door and it sits in front of the sensor. If you're analog, if you're going old school and using film, same concept. It sits in front of the sensor or the film and it opens up, lets some light through and then closes down again. So it just does it just the once. Every time you take a picture, it just opens up and closes. And that's how it controls the amount of light that comes through. The amount of time that that shutter is open is how much it affects your exposure. So if it's really, really fast, just a click, click like that, then you have less light coming through than if it opens up and then closes down again. I think that should be fairly obvious. It's like, imagine you're in bed at night and you're all tucked in nice and warm and it's nice and dark and you're trying to go to sleep and someone opens the door and that hallway light just shines on your face and wakes you up in the middle of the night. The amount of time that door is open makes a difference to you. If they just open and peek and close it, it's just a flash. But if they hold it open, just stand there and look at you, which is kind of creepy, admit it, but there's a lot more light coming through. Shutter speed works kind of in a similar sort of sense. Now we measure it in fractions of a second. We can go from 1/100, 160, 1/30. These are fractions of a second. Of course, each one getting a little bit slower. 1/8 of a second, 1/4, and you can go all the way up to minutes if you want. It all depends on the gear and how controllable it is. In fact, I say minutes. There are some systems that will do hours. If you want to do astrophotography, yeah, some of those equipments, they go for hours at a time. And you can get a lot of creative effects by using the time factor of shutter speed. As I said before, aperture has that secondary effect of depth of field, and the shutter has a secondary effect of motion blur. So as you can imagine, if it's only open for a very, very quick amount of time, it's only allowing it to see, the camera can only see what happens outside in the world as long as that shutter's open. So it's just a tiny little bit. So if someone is running and you have, say, 1/200, you can get a picture of them and they look like they're not moving. They might look like they're floating in midair. They're perfectly crisp and clean. But if you extend that shutter time, if you have it to, say, 1/130, or not 130, 1/30, which is for a runner, for motion, that's actually quite slow. It sounds fast, but it's quite slow. There'd be a lot of blur, a lot of motion blur. To make this more clear, I took some pictures this morning. They're not great pictures. They're not great art. I basically set my camera up and I moved my arm up and down in front of it while adjusting the shutter speed to take different pictures. So here's one at 1/100. That's a fairly fast shutter speed. You can still see it was a bit bright and there's a little bit of motion in my hand. It's not perfectly sharp and clear, but you can see it's a hand. 1/60, a little bit slower shutter speed, a little bit more blur starting to be introduced. Quickly running through these, we got a 1/130, 1/15, 1/8, 1/4, and finally a full half second. And you can see in a half second with my arm moving up and down, that is completely abstract. You can't tell what that blur is at all. So you need to adjust your shutter speed to be appropriate for the thing that you're taking pictures of. Also, you need to adjust your manipulation of the camera to be appropriate. For example, if you put your camera on a tripod, it's not going to move. It is perfectly stable, so you can have a very, very long shutter speed and get lots of blurry lights from cars or motion of all sorts in the image that you want. But if you take the same camera and hold it in your hand, you'll get an almost completely unusable image because everything, your hand is never stable enough to hold a camera like that. So you need to take those sort of things into account. Now, just want to go back and reiterate, the longer the shutter is open, the more light it lets in. The shorter the shutter is open, the less light it lets in. And this is how we affect our exposure. In my last video, I asked a question at the very end. I said, what if I want to have a beautiful, soft depth of field? I want the background to be completely out of focus. I want my subject to be in the front nice and sharp. So I've opened up my aperture. That's what Steve said to do. So I've opened up my aperture and I'm getting this beautiful, soft depth of field, but my picture it's completely overexposed. What do I do? How do we control that? The first thing that you're going to come to is your shutter speed, because now that you understand how shutter speed works, it becomes quite apparent. They both control the flow of light. The aperture is letting in lots of light. Our picture's overexposed, so we need to reduce the amount of light that's coming through. So we're going to need a faster shutter speed. And that is going to give us a better exposure. We use these things in combination. This is why we call it the triangle. There is a third one we'll get to in the next video. But when we use all these things in conjunction, we can use one of them, whichever one you want, for a creative purpose, and we can use the other one to counteract that, to balance it out. I hope that makes sense. This is the difference between merely picking up your camera and just taking a picture with whatever settings it automatically says for you, and thinking creatively, thinking artistically, crafting and creating a picture. Normally, in an average situation, your camera is going to try and give you a fairly fast shutter speed and try to get as much in focus as possible, and it's going to average those out. It's going to give you a pretty mundane picture. But if you try to control one or the other of those, if you want to have a soft background to your depth of field, you're going to have a wide open aperture. If you want to get lots of motion blur, you might want to get a longer shutter speed. If you want to capture something that's happening and you want it to be crisp and sharp and almost like time is frozen, you want to have a shorter shutter speed. So we use these things all in conjunction. Sometimes though, just sometimes, it doesn't work properly because your creative choices are at odds with each other. What if you want to have a soft background? So you're going to have a wide open aperture, But what if you want to have motion blur? So you want to have a lot of a longer shutter speed. So the two of them are going to mean lots of light is coming through, and you have no way to control that. How do you control that? Well, that's where ISO comes in. That's the subject of our next video. And although I did say that everything has a primary and secondary function, ISO's secondary function is not really such a good thing. So we'll get into that with the next video. I hope this has been instructive, informative. If it has, please click some links down below. There's a bunch of them there. I'm not going to give the usual spiel. That's not really my kind of deal. But thank you for watching. And yeah, I'll catch you with the next video. See you later.